Hello, history nerds and historians. My name is Christina, and this is Effed Up History. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from history that's super fucked up. Welcome to the first official episode of Effed Up History. For me, there was absolutely no question about what this first episode was going to be about, because it's one of the things that really started my journey here. I've always been obsessed with weird, unusual, supernatural, overall what many would consider fucked up things like witch trials and the like. And today we will be talking about the Connecticut Witch Trials. So sit back, relax, and practice your, oh good God, what the fuck faces. Now, I bet you might be thinking, Christina, did you say the Connecticut Witch Trials? Because I never knew there was such thing as the Connecticut Witch Trials. But that's okay, because I didn't either until about a year and a half ago. And I found out that there are even people in Connecticut who didn't know that this was a thing, like Benjamin Trumbull, the author of the 1818 book, The Complete History of Connecticut, which said that there was never a witch trial to happen in Connecticut, ever. And it was one of the things that made Connecticut great, especially when you compare it to Massachusetts, just north of there, that was just rife with witch trials, which, obviously isn't the case, because I'm sitting here talking into a mic and you're sitting wherever you are listening to it. But it isn't completely Benjamin's fault. The documentation of the Connecticut witch trials is really sparse. And as we'll see, unfortunately, the people who are supposed to document all of this were not very good at their jobs. Not like in Salem. Those bitches had their shit together in Salem when it came to documenting what happened in the witch trials. Although, to be fair, you can't really fully trust the documents. They were written by court officials who already made up their mind about the verdict before the trial even started. And then the testimonies were made by people who were, allegedly lying and caught up in the hysteria and or had their own personal motives to get back at their neighbors who had wronged them. And then we have that whole governor put a ban on writings and publications about anything having to do with the witch trials in October of 1692, and only allowed Cotton Mather to write about the Salem witch trials. And Cotton had some really nice things to say about the tyrannical murderers, judges, that didn't really seem to align with his own personal opinions, as read in his diaries and letters and other personal effects. Then you have the whole thing that the people who were involved in the witch trials, including some judges, very much regretted their part in what happened and begged for forgiveness and paid retribution later on because they knew that what they did was wrong and they were just caught up in everything. But that's all a story for another day. We will be doing the Salem witch trials at some point, but there are some quick statistics that we can mention about the Salem witch trials, because despite what I said in my undergrad, statistics are important. So the Salem witch trials happened in the winter of 1692. They lasted about 10 months. And then during that time, over 200 people were accused of being a witch, men and women alike, because there was a relatively gender neutral term for the most part, although there were some people who were called a wizard. But for the most part, they were all witches who were accused of witchcraft. Of those 200 plus people, the victims included 19 people who were hanged, at least 5 who died in jail while awaiting their trial or execution, including an infant who was born in prison and then just left there, and then her mom was executed right afterwards. And then of course you have one man who was crushed to death when they were trying to press him for information and a confession. He is the only man in the United States, what is now the United States at least, to have been executed by the peine forte d'or, which is, crushing to death. So, that's a statistic, although I'm sure he's not very happy to be that that statistic, but the Salem witch trials have become like iconic to not only American history but world history. I mean, there are movies, plays, TV shows, songs, like you even do little activities as an elementary school project. There's an episode of Sabrina the Teenage Witch about it. While witch trials have been happening for hundreds of years, Salem was explosive and it was surprising and it was just crazy. And most people are like, how could something like this happen in America? Thank the gods that this was an isolated incident in American history, except for the fact that it wasn't. It wasn't even the first in America. The first mass witch trials in America began in Connecticut in the mid-1600s. During that time, 34 people were accused and 11 of them were executed, although sometimes you'll see even more than that cited. Now, I understand that doesn't sound like a lot in like the grand historical context, what with all of the massacres and genocides and murders that is world history. I mean, when you think about it, Ted Bundy killed more people than those who were executed in the Connecticut Witch Trials. But to do my favorite thing again, which is statistics, over half of the amount of people were executed in Connecticut as the quote iconic and crazy Salem. And to further compare with Salem, in Salem you had a 1 in 10 chance of being executed if you were accused. In Connecticut it was 1 in 3. Which means like I would much rather take my chances in Salem. Also, Salem was over a lot quicker than the trials in Connecticut. So to give a little bit of background on the accusers and the accused in both Connecticut and Massachusetts, we can look first to the Puritans who settled New England in 1620. Puritans were a more extreme faction of Christianity who came to the American colonies to escape religious persecution, only then to like become the persecutors themselves. In puritanical New England, it was literally illegal to practice anything other than Puritanism. Like Mary Wright, for example, who in 1660 was accused of being a witch, which she was later acquitted of. However, she was convicted of being a Quaker and was banished from the colony completely. Or there's also Mary Dyer, who also in 1660 was convicted of being a Quaker and was hanged for it in Boston. So Puritans followed the Bible literally. So in turn, many of the reasons that people were accused had to do with the Bible. This included reasonings like if you had a proud look, or a lying tongue, a heart that devised wicked deeds, and feet that ran swiftly towards mischief. Other reasons that didn't have to directly do with the Bible included if two people accused you, if you got angry when people were questioning you, or if something weird happened that you may have been involved with, or were like in the general vicinity of, possibly, perhaps, maybe. And then these two people that I mentioned who accused you, they didn't have to accuse you of the same thing. One could say they saw you transform into a dog. Another could say that they suffered bad fortune after having harsh words with you, and like that was enough. I apologize if you hear rain. It just started raining outside my window. So ambiance, spooky ambiance. So this is especially true if you were an outspoken older woman of like lower financial standing. That was like pretty much the main demographic who were accused of being a witch. And not just the American colonies, but also in England as well and many other places. That's not to say that there weren't like wealthier people who were targeted, but typically, especially when you compare it to somewhere like Salem, the people who were at the top were typically the accusers. So, the Corwins, they were very wealthy. The Putnams, they were relatively wealthy. But then you do have like Giles Corey. He's one of the people who was executed as a witch in Salem in 1692, and he was very wealthy. So, that's not to say that there weren't people who were wealthy who were accused, but typically it was like if you were a beggar or anything like that. And there's a whole theory that has to do with that I'll probably touch upon at some point that came from England, but I don't want this episode to be even more convoluted than it is. So we're just going to continue and say that you pretty much just couldn't win, period. And, this is not to say, again, that there weren't also men that were accused of being witches, but it was mostly women. Or if it was men, it was typically like husbands and sons of women who were accused. Sometimes they're brothers and fathers, but typically husbands and children, because They believed that witchcraft was matrilineal. And so if your mom was a witch, then you were also a witch, which is just... Okay. Now, to test to see if these accused people were actually witches, investigators used a variety of different methods. Often the first one was just making the accused sit in a room for 24 hours without access to like food or water or pretty much anything that made you feel like a human, to see if a familiar would come and suckle from their witch teats. Now, a witch teat was basically when you sold your soul to the devil as a witch, he would give you a familiar. A familiar was a agent of the devil, a demon of some sort, it was believed, who would disguise themselves as an animal. So typically it was like a cat, a frog, toad, sometimes a butterfly, sometimes a rabbit, like all of these like seemingly harmless animals. They would disguise themselves as that and then, do your bidding for you as a witch. They could transform themselves into other animals. They could transform themselves into what looked like people in the town, and they could go from there. So in repayment for these things that the familiars would do for you, you would have to feed them from your witch teat. Now, this isn't something that would be on your chest or on your breast. It could be anywhere on your body. And in being anywhere on your body, they would have to just sort of examine you all over. If there were no witch teats visible for these familiars, investigators would strip down the accused and shave off all the hair to see if they could find the hidden ones. And then if they were still invisible, the investigators would start poking them with like knives and needles and sharp pins to encourage them to appear. In England, this was literally a profession during the witch trials, especially during the Matthew Hopkins witch trials in the 1640s. And they were called lady prickers because you can't make this shit up. Another method would be to take a dull knife, run it along the arm of the accused, and if they didn't bleed, they'd be a witch. Because I don't know about you, but literally anytime I use a butter knife, I am just at risk of bleeding out. The last method that I'm going to talk about is probably one of the most popular and most well depicted in popular culture, at least that I have seen, which is the water test. This is when they would strap the accused to a chair and just throw them into a body of water. If they floated, it was because the water was holy and the water was sacred and it was rejecting them and they were a witch. And if they sank, then they were deemed innocent, but possibly dead because of the inability to breathe underwater thing that humans have. Like, this was never the intention of the investigators to kill the ones who didn't float, but it did happen. They would typically like tie a rope around them so they could pull them out really easily. But it did sometimes happen that people would die. And if they did, it was unfortunate, but they were with God. So, yeah. The first documented person to be accused of witchcraft in the American colonies altogether was a woman named Grace Dutch. This was in the early 1600s. All the sources that I've found say that she's the first, but they don't give a specific year. Or if they do, it'll be like 16, question mark. So it was sometime after 1620, but before 1647. And after Grace, there were a few people who were accused, but none went through the whole trial to be convicted and then executed. That was until May 26th, 1647, when Alice Young was hanged for being a witch. For those of you like me that are terrible at math, that is 45 years before Salem. So we know about Alice Young from a note written by the first governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop, who wrote, quote, "One blank of Windsor arraigned and executed for a witch." He was probably going to go back and fill it in later, but he didn't. So for a really long time, no one knew who this was. Later, there was a note found from a clerk named Matthew Grant, who wrote in his diary on the same day Alice Young was hanged. And so the mystery was solved. We found out who this mystery person was. She was a witch. But why was it that she was accused of being a witch? What happened at her trial? Why was she executed? We don't know. There are no details about her trial. There's no background information about what led up to her accusation. There's not even a lot of information about her life. Like, some say that she may have been married to a man named John because there are land records that like kind of match up during this time. Some historians will say that she had a daughter also named Alice, who in one account that I read said she was later accused of being a witch in Massachusetts, but I could not find anything about that to back it up on the internet. Historians also think that there was an especially deadly flu season that year, and the people in Connecticut blamed her for it. So, yeah, we don't know anything, which is fine. It's fine. It's fine. I'm fine. It's all fine. We don't need to know why a woman was executed, what she was accused of. We don't need to know anything. It's fine. It's fine. I'm fine. Are you fine? I'm fine. It's fine. So Alice was the first of a whole slew of people who were accused and executed in Connecticut. So the next person to be executed for witchcraft is the first that actually confessed to being a witch in Connecticut that we have on record. Obviously, we don't know if Alice admitted to it because of those wonderful record-keeping skills, but this next person gets a single sentence in the Connecticut record which states, quote, "The jury finds the bill of indictment against Mary Johnson that by her own confession she is guilty of familiarity with the devil." And that's it. But we can thank good old Cotton Mather of later Salem fame because he wrote more about her and her trial in one of his books. According to him, Mary claimed that the devil did her many services, like cleaning out ashes from the fireplace and driving the hogs out to fields. And just who knew the devil was so fucking handy with household chores? I mean, if all I have to do to have someone to do my housework for free is pledge my soul to them and I'll also get magic and a cool pet out of it, like, that is extremely tempting. And if heaven and hell exist and the 17th century Puritans were right about how I get to heaven and hell, I'm going to hell anyway because I know how to read and I think for myself and I'm not submissive to my husband and I'm also, not a Christian. So there you go. Might as well get something out of it while I'm here, right? But her main confession was that she murdered a child and was, quote, unclean with men and devils. So this seems cryptic and supernatural and all of that, but most historians who study this think that it most likely meant that she most likely got pregnant out of wedlock and she either didn't want the baby and then had a miscarriage, or she terminated the pregnancy herself. But because of her really extreme religious beliefs, she interpreted this to be the greatest of all sins and was under the influence of the devil. Mary Johnson was executed in 1648 as a witch. So, like I said, we do have some men who were accused and executed as witches, but again, like I said, they were often the husbands or the children of people who were accused as well. So, next up, we have the first of 7 couples to be accused and the first of 2 to be executed. Their names are John and Joan Carrington. They were charged with, quote, familiarity with Satan and works above the course of nature. Whatever the fuck that means. And they were executed in 1651, but not much more is known about them. Next up, we have Goody Bassett, who we know even less about because, like Alice, there are no records other than the fact that she was executed in 1651. Although apparently she did tell investigators and magistrates that there was another witch in town. Now, while today people would be like, oh, what a snitch, or, oh, she was just trying to get people off of her back and get someone else executed and save her skin. I mean, I wasn't there, obviously. I'm not 400 years old to have witnessed all of this that happened, unfortunately. But during that time period, it's really not unheard of for this to happen and other people to be accused once they confess to being a witch, because the Christians believed in covens. They didn't believe in solitary practitioners. So if there was one person who confessed to being a witch, then that meant that there were other people in town who also were witches. And so sometimes as a point of leverage to get them to confess more people, they would accuse other people to try and not be executed, but oftentimes it was just expected of them. And sometimes they were slightly tortured a little bit to get more answers out of them. So it's not necessarily malicious or nefarious intent all of the time, because the Puritans did have a concept of forgiveness. If you confess to your crimes, then you could be let off. Although, of course, in like Goody Bassett's case and in a lot of other people, that wasn't the case. So, but like, for example, in Massachusetts, the 20 people who were executed were 20 people who never confessed to being a witch, except for the very, very last one. So 19 of the 20 people who were executed never confessed and went to the gallows claiming their innocence. So, yeah, so fun fact, I guess. But most likely, Goody Bassett is the one who accused Goody Knapp of being a witch, which led to her investigation. And then 2 years later, in 1653, she was executed after court records state that they found multiple witch teats and marks all over her body. And like, that was enough. The next person that we have is Lydia Gilbert, who was probably executed as a witch. The records that I found literally say like executed, probably witchcraft. So you gotta love it. Like, as someone who really loves history and as someone who is pursuing a career as a historian, it's great to see records that are just so well kept that we can just have all of this information just at our leisure to just look into, It's just great. I love it so much. So up until this point, the witch trials happen, but they're obviously few and far between. So you have Alice, Mary, Joan, and John, then Goody Bassett, Goody Knapp, and Lydia. So with those 7 people, I mean, you have just as many years going in between for the most part, 6 years, and 7 people being executed in 6 years. So the witch trials were just things that would happen. It's most likely not really anything more than a crime at the same level of theft and murder. At least during this time, that's how it was in England, where it was just sort of like, oh yeah, these are just things that happen. These are just thoughts that happen. Perpetrators are taken to court and then tried. Although also something else to acknowledge, at least in the American colonies, that might contribute to the time between these trials at this point, is the colonies wouldn't see to every case individually as they came up. They would have something called a quarterly court, which means exactly what you think it means, that they would just meet 4 times a year and then just do all of the cases at that point rather than seeing to every individual case. There weren't a lot of judges here in the American colonies, especially in New England. So they just sort of, would travel around and do all of their cases and then go. So that way you didn't have to see to every single case that was like, oh, he stole my horse. Oh, she stole apples from me. Like, most of the time they were really minor crimes and really minor accusations. And then of course you did have cases of like murder or witchcraft or anything like that. But it was just something that happened, and it was just sort of a crime. It was nothing sensational like in Salem. The whole quarterly court is also compared to Salem. They had a court that was specifically established just for witchcraft trials called the Court of Warrior and Terminer. And the Court of Warrior and Terminer saw to every single case individually, but they weren't going to do that for every single case elsewhere. So for the next 9 years or so, it was pretty quiet until 1662, when an 8-year-old girl named Elizabeth Kelly died suddenly and mysteriously and was determined to be the victim of witchcraft. Now, this led to what is known as the Hartford Witch Panic of 1662, which is the first mass witch hysteria in America. Unlike pretty much everything else that has to do with this account that we've talked about of the witch trials in Connecticut, the story of Elizabeth Kelly is actually pretty well documented, but it is mostly documented by her father. So how reliable of a narrator is that? I mean, a grieving father will say many things, so take all of this with a grain of salt. But allegedly, there was a woman named Judith Ayers, also known as Goodwife Ayers or Goody Ayers, because during that time, Goodwife and Goody were just the Puritan version of Mrs. So that's why so many people were called Goody or Goodwife. But Goody Ayers required Elizabeth to drink hot broth. Later that night, Elizabeth started experiencing horrible stomach cramps, so her parents gave her some angelica root for her gastrointestinal issues and then went back to bed. But later that night, Elizabeth sat up and screamed, quote, "Father, father, help me, help me. Goodwife Ayers is upon me. She chokes me. She kneels on my belly. She will break my bowels. She pinches me. She will make me black and blue. Oh, father, will you not help me?" Her father, upon hearing her screams, told her to be quiet and go back to bed so that she would not wake up her mother. Now, like, my first instinct is to be like, wow, what great parenting skills. But, like, I'm a monster if I don't get sleep. And my husband has definitely, like, picked up our child and brought him back into his room quietly before when he wakes up in the middle of the night so that I can get sleep, because I'm a crazy monster when I'm tired. So, my initial thing, my initial reaction was like, wow. But honestly, like, I mean, it's not terrible of a dad if there wasn't actually anything wrong with her and she just had like a little bit of a tummy ache. But this parenting only calmed her for a little while, and then she started again later screaming out, quote, "She torments me. She pricks me with pins. She will kill me. Oh, father, set on the great furnace and scald her. Get the broad axe and cut off her head. And if you cannot give me the broad axe, get the narrow one and chop off her head." Because while they may not have been flexible in their beliefs and religious toleration, Puritans were very flexible with how they carried on their backyard, backstreet executions, So at this point, they started taking Elizabeth's sickness a little bit more seriously and thinking that there was something wrong. It wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just a tummy ache. Like, there was something going on with Elizabeth. Apparently the next day, Judith Ayers came to visit Elizabeth to see how she was doing and to ask her, "Why are you saying all of these terrible things about me?" Judith asked her to shut the fuck up about it. And if she did, she promised that she would buy her beautiful lace. And that was all Elizabeth needed to calm down for the time being, which to me is like a little bit suspicious on Elizabeth's side, but to the Puritans, they saw it as another tick towards Judith being guilty. But later that same night, Elizabeth began calling out again. She asked again for Goody Ayers to be punished, then screamed loudly, quote, "Goody Ayers, she chokes me." And then she died. In addition to starting this panic, Elizabeth was also the first autopsy performed in Connecticut, and she was the first autopsy to be performed in association with a witch trial. So this was mainly because her father refused to bury her until he knew for sure if it was due to witchcraft or not. So her autopsy was carried out 5 days after her death, and there were significant supernatural findings that are just super similar to things that happen naturally when a body is left decomposing and exposed to the elements for 5 days, because there were no refrigerated morgues in 17th century Connecticut. But to them, it was witchcraft. And a month later, Judith Ayers was officially accused and exclaimed, quote, "This will take away my life," because as we have seen, an accusation of witchcraft in Connecticut is never a good thing. During her trial, the main evidence was a story told by her neighbors. They claimed that Judith had told them this fantastical story about how years before, when she was still living in England, there was a man who courted her in London, and they set up a date to meet in the park. She was very excited about it. She was ecstatic. She thought she was going to marry this very handsome, very beautiful man. But as he was walking away, she looked down, and where his feet should have been, there were cloven hooves. And she knew that she had a date with the devil. So she stood him up. She was not going to be courted by the devil. She was a good Puritan woman. She would not marry the devil, would not sell her soul to the devil. And when he went to the park and she stood him up, he was so angry that he tore up an iron fence. And that was enough to convict her. However, she was not executed. She fled to Rhode Island with her husband, who was accused of stealing livestock. Rhode Island was kind of like the Australia of the American colonies, where like if someone was banished or if someone was trying to flee from something, they would go to Rhode Island. It's where, unfortunately, like a lot of criminals were, or a lot of people who like other people didn't want around them. The unfortunate part of the Judith Ayers story is actually their children. Judith Ayers and her husband, when they fled to Rhode Island, they didn't take their kids with them, and their kids were 5 and 8, and they just left them behind, which is like, it's really sad. 200 years later, Chief Medical Examiner H. Weiner Carver II, which is the most badass name that I've ever heard in my entire life, reviewed the case and came to the conclusion that Elizabeth's affliction was not witchcraft, but most likely a mixture of pneumonia and sepsis, which caused her delirium and later her death. Now, that's not to say that Judith Ayers wasn't partially responsible for that. Perhaps the broth that she gave Elizabeth to drink gave the child food poisoning, and that then developed into a further infection. But like witchcraft, the Hartford Witch Panic, as it came to be called, continued and led to the execution of 4 people. Now, unfortunately, again, we don't have a lot of information about these people, but we will talk about them a little bit. First is Mary Sanford, who, surprise, we know very little about. So she, unfortunately, becomes a statistic. And okay, I'm going to go on a rant for a second. The sheer amount of disregard for human life is appalling to me in these cases. I don't care if this person was a witch or a thief or a murderer or whatever other kind of criminal that led to their execution. They're still a person. And I know that these cases are old and I shouldn't like compare them or anything, but I would so much rather historically know about these women than like Ted Bundy and like Ed Gein and Israel Keys, which like every single true crime YouTube channel and every single like true crime podcast and like Dateline TV true crime like has a fucking episode about Ted Bundy and Ed Gein and Israel Keys, and they were garbage people. Now, that's not to say that like the people who were accused and convicted of witchcraft were not also garbage people. Like they could have been, but we don't know. Like I don't know anything about them. I don't know anything about them at all. And like, it's so frustrating. And oh, okay. So even to do like a time appropriate comparison and not compare them to modern day people like Ted Bundy or Israel Keys or Ed Gein, I would so much rather know about these women and these like couple men who were executed than every fucking like thought and bowel movement of goddamn John Smith. Like he was garbage. He was a garbage person. John Smith was garbage. And yet we know every single thing about him. There are historians who like dedicate their life to the study of John Smith. And even if I wanted to dedicate my life to the study of the Connecticut Witch Trials, I wouldn't go anywhere with it because there are no records. That's not to say that records won't be found, because people are finding things every day, that they find a trunk in their basement that's like their great 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 grandmother's or something. But like, as it is, there's really nothing to be found about it, and there's really nothing to talk about, and it's so frustrating because these were people and they deserve to at least have a snippet, more than a sentence in the record that just says that they were hanged with no explanation about why or what happened. So rant over. So the next people to be executed is the second couple that we have in Connecticut. So it's the second man that we have in the Connecticut to be accused and convicted and executed for witch trials. This is also like one of the most incredibly petty revenge stories that I think I've ever read about. So Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith were both accused of being a witch, but Nathaniel was acquitted and Rebecca was convicted. Now, I don't know what their charges were initially because, again, listen to above rant, but I'm honestly not surprised that Nathaniel was let off and Rebecca wasn't, due to the just overall opinion of women during this time in puritanical New England. While in jail, she decided that instead of trying to fight it, knowing that her chances were really slim, she just embraced it and confessed, hoping that maybe she would be pardoned, hoping maybe they would forgive her if she, you know, confessed to the crime, because they do have the Puritan concept of forgiveness. She said she was in fact guilty, and she often went off and danced and had sexual relationships with the devil, but she had not yet given the devil her soul because she was waiting until Christmas. Now, I know she probably said this for like a shock factor, as an ultimate disrespect to God and Jesus, that on his holy day you would sell your soul to the devil. But I'm a millennial and I grew up watching SNL. And so like the only thing that I think of is like, it's my soul in a box. It's my soul in a box, girl. Like, oh, like Dick in a Box, Justin Timberlake image of just like Justin Timberlake with the fake beard, holding a box, but this one has a soul inside. Like, that's just what my mind goes to, which is terrible. But so Rebecca continued her confession after this and said that she'd done all of these things, but she was not alone when she was doing all of this with the devil. Her husband was with her the entire time and did everything that she did too, and I mean everything. She also stated that she constantly saw small, unnatural creatures around him, and that he was able to cut wood down that no man should be able to cut on his own. And when Nathaniel heard about this, he confronted her in prison and he asked her to recant her statements. He promised her that if she did, he would continue to take care of her 2 teenage children from her previous marriage, and she could die knowing that her children would be taken care of, and she wouldn't have to die with any worries or concerns. He would make sure that it happened. So Rebecca told the investigators just that. She was like, he came to me in prison and tried to bribe me with taking care of my children if I recanted my statement. What? Why would he do that? And the investigators were like, it is because he is a fucking witch. That's why. And in probably the most awkward couple activity that I can think of, they were executed together in 1662. Now, the last person to be executed during this Hartford witch panic is a woman named Mary Barnes. She was a servant who may have been named by someone else trying to escape their own execution. She was executed in 1653. Again, we don't know much. And I know that it might be annoying for me to like name names and not give details. Obviously, I think it's annoying. See previous rant. But I think it's important to at least say their names and acknowledge their existence. And while I can't give them justice that they most likely deserved, because I do believe that all of the people, for the most part, who were accused, convicted, and executed of witchcraft, not only in the American colonies, but in Europe, a greater part of Europe as well, were most likely innocent. Or at least if they were guilty of something, it wasn't it wasn't witchcraft to the extent that they accused the people of. But I can't give them justice, but I can make sure that they're remembered, especially considering that they were forgotten for so long. And that, I don't want them to just fall into the abyss of historical records again, especially when you just consider, like, we didn't even know Alice Young's name for a really long time, and she was the first person to be executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. The one positive thing that I can say is that although the witch trials did continue after Mary Barnes' execution, she was the last person to be executed in Connecticut for witchcraft. And I think that is largely due to the efforts of John Winthrop Jr. John Winthrop Jr. was the eldest son of the first governor of Massachusetts, who was also named John Winthrop. He was the one who oversaw Alice Young's trial and execution. Maybe perhaps seeing his father's role in her trial and others made Junior the way that he was. He was governor of Connecticut in 1657 and then again 1659 to 1676. He was widely renowned for his, quote, first-hand knowledge of natural magical practices associated with alchemy, which is just like in early chemistry, where alchemists attempted to transform organic compounds to precious stones and metal, which, is that not magic? It was also said that he was an astronomer and he was known for his uncanny healing abilities. It was said that he could cure someone of an illness that he had never seen before with remedies that he had never used before. He spoke out to his constituents that he believed that there were actually witches in Connecticut, but that there should be a distinction between like natural magicians and diabolical magicians, and Puritans were way too quick to just jump straight to the Satan argument when not everyone who practiced witchcraft was a follower of Satan, and that's because I think he was a fucking witch. Witchcraft is not about worshiping the devil and like sacrificing babies and dancing naked under the full moon while giving your soul to Satan. I mean, there are people who do that, but they're like definitely the minority. And in the witch community, they're like relatively looked down upon for the most part. Like actual witchcraft tends to be working with herbs, working with the cosmos, healing, working with energies, like pretty much everything that John Winthrop did. He also argued that spectral evidence, like what we saw, or like rather didn't see with Elizabeth Kelly, was no longer sufficient evidence, and that there needed to be concrete proof and multiple people stating that they personally witnessed the same thing, not like how it was where one person could say one thing, another person could say another, and it was sufficient. This completely changed how witch trials were done and led to significantly less convictions and no more executions in association with witchcraft. In fact, during the whole Hartford witch panic of 1662 and 1663, John Winthrop Jr. wasn't even in the American colonies. He was in England trying to get a charter for Connecticut. So the monarchy had like just been restored, and he needed to make sure that everything was good to go for them, and that they still had support from the king because they were an American colony, and they had to know like what they could and couldn't do under his rule. Also, they had to just show support for him, considering a lot of Puritans were supporters of the execution of his father, and some of the people who like signed the execution order of King Charles I lived in New England. So because of this witchy governor, the hysteria died down a lot even after his death in 1676. That is until 1692, which is just a terrible year for people accused of witchcraft in general. But in 1692, a 17-year-old French servant named Catherine Branch was picking herbs in the field when she started feeling a prickling in her chest, which was followed by convulsions and almost swallowing her tongue, which I know may sound a lot like epilepsy, but it is not. It was definitely, obviously, witchcraft. Then she began having visions. First, she saw cats talking to her, inviting her to banquets where they would shower her with gifts. And if she did not come, they threatened that they would throw rats at her. Then she started seeing a woman in a silk hood with a blue ribbon standing outside of her home. This woman later became an old hag that wore a homespun wool cloak with 2 firebrands on her forehead. And then this old hag with 2 firebrands on her forehead started becoming different women from the town, which led to multiple women being accused. So 2 of the main women that were accused were Mercy Disborough and Elizabeth Clawson. We know some of the information about them because they were both subjected to the water test, and it was actually really well documented. Mercy actually requested the water test because she was so sure that she would sink, because she knew she was innocent, and in her mind, like, even if she drowned, she was a good Puritan, she was a woman of God, she would be absolved of any sins. But when they put her in the water, she floated like a fucking cork. Even when they tried to physically like push her under the water, she would just pop right back up. So Elizabeth also floated and was found to have multiple witch teats and multiple marks all over her body, which included a 1-inch growth near her nether lips, which is disgusting to call it nether lips, but gotta love Puritans. However, Elizabeth was so well loved that even though there were many telltale signs that pointed to her guilt that would have convicted her and had her executed in a lot of other places, 76 people from the town came forward and spoke in her defense, and she was acquitted. But Mercy was convicted. She received a stay of execution, though, and was later pardoned. The final witch trial in Connecticut happened in August of 1697 when Winifred Benham and her daughter, the younger Winifred Benham, were both accused. This was the 3rd time that the elder Winifred was accused, and the family was so over it that Winifred's husband threatened to shoot the accuser in the face. Like, literally. However, all evidence was deemed spectral and speculative, and the case was dismissed. Now, this is not the last witch accusation to happen in Connecticut, I'm sure, but this was the last to be brought to trial. And that's the big difference. It's one thing to like accuse your neighbor it's another thing to bring them to court over it where they might die over it. In 1750, witchcraft was just removed from the laws as a capital offense entirely. After Salem, witch trials in general put a really bad taste in everyone's mouth. Salem was regarded as a, quote, miserable toil and great noise, and nobody wanted to be associated with them. But most likely the reason why it was written out of the laws is because in 1735, England eliminated it as a capital offense, and English law and English colony laws were like pretty much the same until, of course, 1776, which was just a revolutionary year. Oh God, that's terrible. Please listen to my future podcasts with my bad jokes. Thank you so much for listening today. If you have any stories from history or mythology that you would like to hear me discuss, please reach out. I'm always looking for new ideas. That's really like my intention with this podcast. I want to talk about untold history. I want to talk about weird history. I want to talk about like really cool people who overcame society that was terrible. I want to talk about mythology that's really weird or really fucked up. There's a lot of it. A lot of mythology is really fucked up. Eventually I might talk about true crime. I don't know if you would really fully consider like witch trials a true crime case. So I guess this could technically be true crime as well. But I do want to talk about true crime cases in the future at some point. But so it's just kind of like my plan. So if you like what you heard today and you like those things that I just mentioned that I might include in the future, just please consider subscribing. Or, you know, if you listen to a few more episodes and you decide that you like it, consider leaving a review. I would really appreciate it. And all of my contact information, if you have any ideas, is going to be in the description. You can email me at effeduphistory@gmail.com, or you can reach out on any of my socials, which are at effeduphistory. And remember, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. Bye.